They say that time is a river that washes everything clean, but my memory is not a river. It is a cistern, stagnant and deep, where things rot but do not disappear. I am an old man now, and the details of my life are like the frescoes in the village chapel, flaking away, leaving only patches of vibrant, terrifying color. Sometimes I wonder if I have invented the parts that make me look less like a monster, or if the fear really was that palpable, a living thing that sat on my chest like a wet wool coat. The year was 1944. I remember the smell of the cellar in Borgo, San Lorenzo. It was not the good smell of resting wine or curing prosciutto. It was the scent of wet limestone, mildew, and the metallic, ozone tang of the radio set that sat on the crate before me. It was a Telefunken, a heavy, hateful box of black metal and bakelite that I had been taught to worship and fear. My hands, which I look at now and see only age spots and tremors, were then the hands of a farmer. They were thick, stained with walnut juice and soil, calloused from the hoe and the pruning shears. They were hands made for coaxing life from the Tuscan clay, not for manipulating the delicate, shivering dials of a German transmitter. I felt ridiculous, a bear trying to thread a needle. The headphones squeezed my skull, pressing the sweat-soaked hair against my temples. I was 32 years old, a man of the soil, a father, a husband, and I was a spy. The word tasted like ash. I was not a spy for ideology. I did not care for the Duce's jaw-jutting speeches or the cold, precise cruelty of our German allies. I was a spy because the tenant had come to my farm in a black car and told me that if I served as their eyes in the hills, the bombs would miss my roof. He promised that the requisitions of grain and livestock that were starving my neighbors would pass my gate by. He offered me a perimeter of silence in a screaming world. So I sold my soul for a sack of flour and a promise. In the damp dark, I closed my eyes and tried to summon the ordinary world I had lost. I tried to smell the sun-baked earth of the upper field, the sweet, cloying scent of the crushed grapes during the harvest, the dust rising from the road as the sheep moved to higher pastures. I wanted to be Marco the farmer, worrying about the blight on the olive trees or the price of feed. But the silence of the cellar was heavy, suffocating. Above me, the house breathed. A floorboard groaned under weight. I froze. My hand hovered over the tuning knob, trembling. The silence stretched tight as a wire fence. Was it Elena? If my wife found me here, huddled over this machine, speaking in codes to the men who occupied our country, she would not see a husband protecting his family. She would see a collaborator. She would see a traitor. Or perhaps it was not Elena. Perhaps the partisans had finally come. They knew everything. The men of the hills. They had eyes in the trees. If they found this radio, they would not ask questions. They would drag me to the square, and my children would watch their father swing. The sound came again, a settling of the timber. Nothing more. The house was old, shifting in its sleep. I let out a breath that rattled in my lungs. Then the static in my ears broke. It was not a voice. It was never a voice. It was the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of Morse code, cutting through the atmospheric hiss like a knife. I was not fluent in this language of dots and dashes. I had to transcribe it laboriously, letter by letter, my pencil snapping under the pressure of my grip. The message ended. The static returned, a wash of gray noise. I stared at the paper. Watchpoint Alpha. That was the ridge overlooking the Siv River, near the old Roman bridge. It was a crucial artery. If the Allies crossed there, the Gothic Line would rupture like an overripe melon. I had my orders. The safety of my farm, the lives of my children, the sanctity of my home. It was all contingent on me leaving this cellar and climbing into the dark. I turned off the radio. The silence rushed back in, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of what I had to do. I packed the equipment into the burlap sack that usually held seed potatoes. I was a farmer going out to sow death. Operation Olive Thump. Thump, thump. It grew louder with every step, a percussion that vibrated in the soles of my boots. I reached the rocky outcrop that overlooked the bridge an hour later. My chest was heaving. I slid into the crevice between two boulders, a natural blind I had used years ago to watch for hawks. Below me, the valley opened up. The river was a ribbon of black silver. The bridge stood stark and geometric, a feat of engineering that looked fragile against the raw power of the landscape. I set up the binoculars. These were German optics, Zeiss glass, clearer than my own eyesight. I adjusted the focus, the wheel turning smoothly under my thumb. The bridge leaped into clarity. I scanned the supports, the road surface. At first, nothing. Then movement. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness under the arch. A small team. They were working quickly, placing objects against the stone pillars. Explosive, partisans, sabotage specialists. They were going to blow the bridge before the Germans could use it for a counterattack, or perhaps to stop the Germans from retreating, trapping them here to be slaughtered. I needed to report this. I needed to call in the coordinates. The mortar team stationed on the ridge behind me was waiting for my signal. One barrage would wipe them out, save the bridge for the RSI, and prove my loyalty. I focused the lenses tighter. One of the figures stepped back to signal the others. He turned his head, looking up toward the heights, as if he sensed eyes upon him. The moonlight caught his face. The breath jammed in my throat. The binoculars nearly slipped from my sweating hands. The face was younger than mine, cleaner, but the eyes were the same. The set of the jaw was the same. It was the face I had washed when he was a baby. It was the face I had sat opposite at the dinner table every Sunday for 20 years. It was Matteo, my brother. He was down there, wiring the explosives, and I was up here with the radio that would kill him. The artillery thumped in the distance, closer now, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears, a roar of panic and horror that drowned out the war. The radio sat beside me, the handset waiting. I stared through the glass, paralyzed, as the ghost of my ordinary world collided with the nightmare I had chosen. The radio hissed. A viper coiled in the dark beside me. Static cut through the night air, sharp and rhythmic, like the wheeze of a dying lung. I stared at the handset. It was heavy black bakelite, cold as a tombstone against my sweating palm. Below, in the monochromatic world of the binoculars, Matteo moved. He had that familiar loping gait, the same one I had watched 1,000 times as he crossed the furrowed fields to bring me water during the harvest. But now, he was not carrying a flask. He was wrapping wire around a stone piling, his movements jerky, efficient, terrified. Conti, the voice in my ear was jagged. Oberleutnant Muller. Status, do you have visual on the structure? I swallowed, but my throat was full of dust. The mortar crew was 300 meters behind me, dug into the clay. They had the coordinates dialed in. A single word from me, affirmative, and 6 tubes would cough steel into the sky. 30 seconds later, the graceful archway would turn into a slaughterhouse. Matteo would be nothing but red mist and memory. Conti, report. The demand hammered against my skull. If I stayed silent, Muller would know. He would send a patrol. They would find the partisans. They would find me. And when the math was done, they would trace the silence back to Borgo San Lorenzo. They would find my mother, my father. They would hang them from the plane trees in the square, placards around their necks. Fruit for the crows. The Germans did not forgive incompetence. They punished it with fire. I looked through the glass again. Matteo had paused. He looked up right at my position on the ridge. He could not see me in the shadows of the cypress grove, but he felt the weight of the gaze. Brothers, no. We share blood. We share the same pull of the earth. He wiped his forehead with the back of a dirty sleeve. He went back to the detonator. My thumb hovered over the transmission key. The metal bit into my skin. I was a farmer. I knew how to prune a vine to save the stalk. You cut the sick branch. You burn the blight. But this was not pruning. This was cutting out my own heart to save the body. The artillery from the south rumbled, a thunderstorm walking up the valley, closer now. The Allies were coming. If the bridge stood, the Germans could counterattack. If it fell, they were trapped, and the RSS would be liquidated. Conti, I am losing patience. Is the asset compromised, yes or no? The question hung in the air, simpler than a prayer, heavier than the world. I watched Matteo connect the final lead. He waved to his men. They began to scramble up the bank, away from the charges. They were too slow. If the mortars fired now, they would catch them on the slope. I looked at my brother. I looked at the radio. My hand trembled a leaf in a gale. I pressed the key. The static broke. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, a man already dead. Oberleutnant, I rasped. Visual confirmed. Target acquired. I closed my eyes. I saw Matteo's face at his first communion. I saw him laughing as we crushed grapes in the vat, purple juice staining our shins. Negative, I lied. The words tasted of ash. Sector is clear. Movement was. Livestock, stray cattle, no partisans. Are you certain? We have reports. I am the eyes. Oberleutnant, the bridge is clear. Hold fire. Save the shells for the tanks. There was a pause, a silence that stretched until it felt like the skin of a balloon about to burst. Verstanden, holding fire. Keep watching. I released the key. The air left my lungs in a sob I choked back. I had bought them time. I had sold my soul. Below, a spark, then a flash that turned the night into noon. The roar hit me a second later, a physical blow that knocked the wind out of me. The center span of the bridge lifted, hung suspended in a cloud of dust and fire, and collapsed into the river. The water boiled. Conti, you traitorous swine, Conti. The radio screamed. The mortars began to fire blindly, panicked, useless rounds bracketing the hills. I didn't answer. I ripped the cord from the box. I smashed the radio against the rock, shattering the tubes, silencing the German voice. I grabbed my rifle, but not to fight. I ran. I ran through the olive groves, sliding on the scree, tearing my uniform on the thorns. I ran away from the Germans, away from the bridge, away from the brother I had saved and the duty I had murdered. The war did not end that night. It dragged on, a wounded animal bleeding out across the Gothic Line. I hid in barns and bombed out churches. I ate rot to survive. When the Americans finally rolled through, chewing gum and handing out cigarettes, I walked back to Borgo San Lorenzo. I was not a hero. I was not a villain. I was just a man who had survived the thrashing. The farm was still there. The house was pockmarked by shrapnel, the roof of the barn gone. But the walls stood. My father was dead, typhus, they said, not a bullet. My mother was a husk, staring at the wall. And Matteo was there. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a leg that had been shattered by a fall during the retreat from the bridge. He looked at me when I walked in. He looked at the grime on my skin, the hollows of my cheeks. He knew I had been with the RSI. The village knew. They spat on the ground when I walked to mass. They called me fascist, collaborator. But Matteo never asked where I was that night. He never asked why the mortars didn't fire when he was exposed on the bank. He never asked why the German machine gun nest on the ridge remained silent. We worked the land together. We rebuilt the barn. We planted the wheat. But the silence between us was a third person at the table. Every time I looked at him, I saw the crosshairs. Every time he looked at me, I saw the question he was too afraid to ask. He knew someone had watched him. He knew someone had let him live. Years turned into decades. The vines grew thick and gnarled. The village forgot. Mostly, the hate softened into a dull wariness. I married, buried a wife, raised children who moved to the city to work in factories. I stayed. Now I sit on this porch. The sun is setting over the valley. The bridge was rebuilt. Concrete and steel, ugly but strong. The cars rush over it, people going to Florence, to Bologna, worrying about money, about love, about nothing. They talk about the resistance as if it were a holy war. Good against evil, black against white. They build monuments. They give speeches. They do not know the gray. They do not know the mud. I look at my hands. They are spotted with age, trembling like they did that night on the ridge. I am a farmer, yes, but I never planted a seed that grew straight after the war. The soil remembers. You can turn it over, you can fertilize it, but the blood is still there. deep down in the roots. My machine is broken. The mechanism inside me that told me what was right and what was wrong, it snapped when I pressed that transmission key. I saved my brother, but I betrayed my oath. I saved my blood, but I doomed the men who relied on my eyes. Was it courage, or was it cowardice? I look out at the fields. The wheat is golden, ready for the scythe. It waves in the wind, indifferent to the history buried beneath it. They give you a flag, a gun, a reason. But in the end, you are not fighting for a country. You are fighting for a brother, a wife, a patch of dirt. And you are asked to make choices that God himself would not dare to make. The question is not what you would die for. It is what and who you are willing to live with. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.